All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. For those of you that could make it today and that registered, my name is Matt Cowell. I'm the CEO at QuantHub, and I have two awesome panelists joining today. I have Randi Ludwig from Dell and Natt from Econ One. Randi is in Texas, in Austin, and Amar is in Los Angeles. And so I was fortunate enough to actually meet both of them via Twitter and just the data science community, and thought they would be great people to speak on this topic. Both have doctorates and are practicing data scientists in one way or another, and have a lot of thoughts on model bias and also how to validate models and to prevent bias and to make sure that you're getting the results that you think you're getting from the work you're doing. And so just briefly, kind of about the webinar series here and what we're doing. So this webinar series is all about the top 5 pitfalls to avoid when developing your data science team. And so this is part 3, and we have a couple more coming. We're trying to do these monthly. The first 2 were around really aligning the strategy of the business with the priorities of the data science and advanced analytics organization. The second was around working in silos, also kind of just around organizational structures and how to actually structure the organization in the most effective way to deliver great results. This one being the third one, and of course talking about bias and model validation. And we'll continue on from here. We have the fourth will be around engaging your team's inner problem solver, and as a way to really get creativity flowing through the team and ideas coming from everywhere and not just from a select few. And then in the fifth one, we'll talk about training opportunities and how to kind of upskill teams. So with that being said, we are also going to so just a little bit about us at QuantHub. The reason we're doing this is we're all about building data science teams, and so we partner with companies in sort of the technical screening. We have a technical screening platform just focused on advanced analytics, and also a platform focused on ongoing skill development. And so we're all about helping companies build data science teams, which is why this topic is sort of near and dear to our heart. We will pause at the end, and there will be time for questions. And so as you have questions, please type them into Zoom. And after we have some kind of facilitated discussion that I'll facilitate with Amar and Randi, then at the end we'll certainly pause and have time for your questions. And so feel free to submit those as we go. Okay. All right. So let me actually stop my share. Okay. And so as we kind of get started, Amar and Randi, thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I think the first area that I wanted to just kind of jump into is really methodology. So if we're thinking bias and which both of you have strong feelings around bias, we were just talking about it before we started here. Talk about that as it relates to the methodological approach that you take for data science. So how you actually go all the way from kind of inception of a project all the way through to delivering something into production and having a model in production and running. How do you actually approach that from a methodology standpoint to reduce bias and also produce validated models that you are confident in the quality? Randi, do you want to start?
Sure. I think there's 2 main pieces to it. Well, I guess there's 3. So I usually describe the data science process as being broken into kind of 5 stages. You are doing some degree of data engineering, pulling data from somewhere. There's different transformations you'll need to do to curate that data and make it a model building. Then you need to do some amount of data analysis to understand what might be useful in your data to actually build models on top of, then building the model, productionalizing it, and monitoring and maintaining it once it's out there. And I think really those first 3 stages all have lots of opportunities to look for bias. You can look for bias in the incoming data that you have, but you can also look in the kind of features that you look to create. Amar has some really good examples of places where you could do that. But then the other piece, I think, is in the model testing and validation stage. One of the interesting things about machine learning models is there's kind of different strategies depending on what problem you're trying to solve. And if you're trying to replicate existing human behavior, then you just want to take in a whole bunch of data and then like make a model that represents current state reality. But sometimes you don't want to make a model that represents current state reality. You want to make a model to influence behavior or change reality. And so in those cases, sometimes what I've seen happen, even internal to business problems at Dell, is like you create a curated data set of, you know, the best case scenarios, the best examples possible of what you want, the behavior you want to replicate. And then whenever you're building a model, you do your test train split. And then when you test out against that holdout sample, you have some accuracy measure. But because that test set is only a subset of your curated data, it's not a subset of reality, then that model accuracy doesn't necessarily reflect how it's going to perform out in the world. And I think that's a place where a lot of people get hung up on the right way to go about building models and validating them in the first place is what is it that you're actually validating against? Just because it works in your sandbox against your test data doesn't mean it's going to work out in the world. And so you have to think about both of those stages in order to get models that are actually useful. And so in terms of the validation part, I think that's a really big key that a lot of people sometimes miss. Amar?
So I definitely agree. And I think that as an economist and doing more causal inference and econometric type models, we spend a lot of time thinking about demand structures and market drivers and what's the data generating process behind all of this. And so, you know, that gives us a lot of opportunities to look at our variables and the things that we think are important and say, okay, and what are we actually measuring when we use this? What are we proxying for? And the example I gave is I do a lot of loyalty program analysis. I am given completely de-identified transactional data. But things like gender and race and all of those protected classes that we don't touch and don't go anywhere near, they still come out in the data. And so we think a lot about, you know, what are we actually measuring for? What is this proxying? When I interpret this coefficient and this driver, is it really what I think it is? And so we have to do a lot of that, especially with, you know, working with personally identifying information data that where we know we have these factors, but we're not integrating them into the model. And then with validation, I definitely agree. I think that a lot of people, when the danger of the fact that you're getting a whole bunch of data and then you have to curate it and build it into something analyzable means that you are by necessity losing some of the features of reality there. And so you can sometimes come up with models that look like they perform fabulously and then you deploy them in real life and you're like, yeah, this isn't working very well. And so I think that's something that people miss. I think we have a lot of conversation around what's the bias in the underlying data. How do we compensate for that? How do we, if we're not compensating for it, at least be aware of that and understand that and how it's influencing our results? But you can introduce bias in your model through poor modeling technique or through, you know, poor validation or overfitting. You know, bias isn't just coming from the data.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It comes from every stage of the process, all the way back to what problem are you trying to solve, and if there's not great clarity or there's some ambiguity there, and you're focused a little bit off of the problem that you actually need to be solving, you know, it almost starts from the very beginning. So what have you actually seen some of the implications to be of having issues like the ones we were just talking about, just in terms of the overall business or the results that you're trying to achieve? You know, what have you seen the effect to be?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've read Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, but it's really fantastic. I read it about a year and a half ago or so, and we came across a problem internally where we were looking to help customers who were had their own IT departments. So I work in the services part of Dell, so anything reported to tech support or repairs or like that sort of stuff is kind of in our domain. And we were looking to be able to identify times when maybe we want to audit the requests for parts that our partners send in. So, it's a school district or a small business or something, and they had their own IT guy, and he doesn't need us to tell him how to fix it. He just needs a part. What fraction of those should we audit, and that sort of thing. And one of the things that crossed my mind, because I had just recently read that book, is the idea of doing some sort of customer segmentation in that situation. Immediately puts smaller partners in a potentially bad situation, and there could be negative ramifications of any model that we build because we're aggregating people together in ways that maybe they don't have a whole lot of control over, or their results for many months, quarters to come could be determined by the actions of one bad actor who happened to be at that business 6 months ago that they already have let go and doesn't even work there anymore, right? Or something like that. So at what level of granularity is the right place to even make a model, and how will it impact the people who are the recipients of the model outputs, I think is, and even though it's the same question, but how it gets used is still something that you can worry about in terms of bias against all kinds of different backgrounds.
Yeah. How about you, Amar? Maybe on the validation side, where where you felt like there was a time when, or you've seen inadequate validation on the back end of the model, and what kind of results or ramifications you've seen.
So many of my colleagues are expert witnesses, and so I do a lot of econometric modeling. I help out with that, and these are giant class action lawsuits, antitrust, price fixing. These are major cases, and we've seen cases fall apart because of a bad model. Cases are won or lost on an expert model. So the stakes are actually really high for a lot of my colleagues. And, I do more valuation side, business side econometric modeling, which is, to me, slightly lower stakes, but I'm sure my clients who, if they deploy a bad model and they book their financials with it, are looking at, hundreds of millions of dollars of adjustments on a publicly held company would definitely disagree that my stakes are lower. But yeah, I have seen, and again, we do a lot of user behavior modeling for the type of work I do. And as Randi said, if you aggregate, I run everything at sort of the user level, but then I do have to aggregate up because those individual results aren't necessarily helpful in terms of implementing any sort of policy based on that. And when I start aggregating up, you lose some of that information. Every time you aggregate up, you're giving up information. And aggregating poorly or choosing a bad way to segment your customers can really skew your results badly. And I've done it, and it's a terrible feeling. And all you can do is audit your process. I bring my models to someone who's not involved with my project to get a sanity check on my methodology from someone who's not fully invested and like knee deep and having all of the sort of business side demands, because sometimes you don't want to create incentive, your models, you don't want your models to be built based on, trying to find the results that your client wants.
Right.
Right. And so as a check for that, I try and go to people who aren't involved to just give me that sniff test of, what you're doing is reasonable, or have you thought about what that's going to do?
Right. When you talk to Mara then about sort of aggregating up and some of the challenges that come with that, sticking on that conversation a little bit around data, the segmentation, but even pulling it back from there and sort of the pre-processing and actually prepping data. So what have you guys seen from that perspective in causing issues in, really in the context of this conversation? And what do you do about that, when some of the source data is causing these issues?
Tunnel vision. So what I see a lot is very talented and very bright economists and data scientists working with only the data the client has given them, instead of thinking about what is the data that is appropriate to answer this question. Mm-hmm. And there's so many sources of data available today. It's just so many. And sometimes supplementing with an outside data source can fill some of the gaps or the blind spots that exist in the data that you were given by the client.
Right.
And so I think that I see that tunnel vision a lot. I think it happens at the very beginning. You have this talk with the client about what their needs are, what question you're trying to answer,
Right.
and you've already started down a path. And it's easy to sort of mentally get locked into that path. And then they give you this data and you start thinking, this is the data you have. So that, I mean, from my perspective, I see that as.
Yeah. Randy, how about you see that much?
Yeah, I like that idea of you always, I mean, just human nature is that if you're asked a question and you're presented with some information to answer that question, then you go at it with, this is the data I have. How am I going to answer that question with the data I have? One of the things that I have been pushing for a lot lately in terms of just like general data science strategies is that I think there's a big difference between doing data science in internet native companies where they've been collecting data all along or have the ability to quickly change their data collection mechanisms versus legacy companies. I mean, Dell honestly is more of a manufacturing company than a tech company. And so it's more like comparing to GM or something like that.
Yeah.
In terms of like the way the function that the company works. And so when you're dealing with a bunch of legacy data systems and things like that, it's a useful approach to build something with what you have, assuming that the bias that's there isn't going to negatively impact you in a really harmful way. Knowing that there's bias in it though, and then use that data science system that you put in place to actually collect new, better data going forward. So you can identify the holes in the process of building a data science product and then actually use the product to fill the holes going forward. Yeah,
that makes sense. So when you guys think about some of the challenges that you're talking about, what types of, processes or even people do you put in place in the overall process to actually avoid some of the challenges or to sort of counter some of the risks that we're talking about here, whether it's in the sampling of the data or it's in further down the process of the actual modeling? What are you putting in place, checks and balances from a process standpoint, but also sort of roles on a team to counter that?
Yeah. Amar, do you have a quick answer to that? Because I don't really.
I don't know if it's a quick answer. I do think for us, I think off the top of my head, I know I talk about it a lot, but I just find it so incredibly valuable. An audit process, right? Yeah. You've got, we have our core team that's going to work on the project, and then we have a group of backup people, and it's not a lot of people, but one person at my level, an economist, and then an analyst who are, the analyst is auditing our code and doing teardowns to make sure that, my analysts who are knee deep in this aren't missing things. But to me, what's really great is that I've got another economist who's coming at me and who's not attacking, but poking holes in my methodology and my approach. Because in litigation, this is all going out and then an expert on the opposing side is going to destroy it. Right. And so I'd rather have someone I know do that for me first. And I've implemented it with my business modeling too, with business consulting. When I work with clients who, just on econometric modeling or data science to optimize their operations or understand their markets or their drivers or outcomes or any of that, I always bring in another economist and just, I think that the key skill here is being open to being wrong.
Yeah.
And I let them sort of audit my thought process.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I kind of think of it just like academic peer review, right?
Yeah.
You want the best ideas and the best methodologies to actually come to fruition. And in order to do that, you need iterations and all of that. And I guess we don't have anything formalized as a process other than before any of our teammates put models into production, we do have code review with another person on the team. I do really love your idea, though, of enforcing that person be not actively working on the project, because then it gives them like a more fresh set of eyes and less vested interest in being right, I guess. Right now we don't operate that way, but I would love to see us doing that more going forward.
What I found with that is that you avoid that problem of if someone has knowledge of the project, they'll make assumptions and they won't question certain pieces of the code that they probably should, or of the thought process that they probably should, because they're just following your train of thought.
Yeah.
How often? In that way, oh, go ahead, Randy. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm curious how often you initiate this sort of peer review audit process. Is it something that you only do like when you're like about to send the thing off to the client? Or so we have kind of a continuous development process for our models, and so I can imagine that like pulling in people from different other teams every couple of weeks as we make tweaks to our models and stuff probably isn't worth it. But anytime we're setting up a new, completely different model, maybe to bounce that across some other people is a good time then. I'm curious.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything has to be fully audited before it goes out, of course. But you know, I personally would prefer to not start going down a path that someone's eventually going to be like, yeah, you put in all this work and this is a terrible idea. So for whoever is doing my checks, I try and build a check-in basically weekly, and I return the favor. I'll check in with their project, whatever they're working on. And you know, some weeks I won't have anything for them and some weeks they won't have anything for me. But this way we sort of have like a standing check-in on projects for different people. And it's also great because then it keeps sort of everybody informed about what everyone else is doing too.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, there are two types of testing in general, just conceptually. There's sort of your white box testing and your black box testing. And you guys are sort of talking about both of those types. Randy, when people are actually doing peer reviews and they're actually looking at your code, it's much more white box type testing, right? They're actually seeing inside and they need some familiarity of what's going on to be able to even do that. But the black box is very useful as well, because then you're going to get a completely different perspective that comes from actually not knowing that information.
Right.
And certainly both types of testing are, can be really, really invaluable. Do you see in maybe Randy, do you see it at Dell that this would maybe evolve and there will be roles focused on this? Or do you think it will always just be sort of peer data scientists that'll be responsible for helping in this way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's the general question of like just testers in general for any kind of product development. Yeah. The approach that we've pretty much tended to take is having testers be people who are already around, already with the skill set, rather than having specific roles for that. Because like Amar is saying, like you don't necessarily need it every single week. It's not something that's at a constant volume. And so it maybe doesn't make sense to have somebody whose whole role is defined to do that. Yeah. I also think if you had somebody whose role was to code review everybody else, it's hard to jump between that many totally different things. So I think it would be hard to implement in only selected individuals. But one of the things that we've actually been talking about, this just prompted, we had a discussion amongst the data science community yesterday about kind of instituting a mentorship buddy system sort of thing for as we onboard new data scientists of somebody who's not on their team. And I would love to see that turn into this kind of audit process. It's like, okay, what are you working on? And then like, let's bounce methodologies back and forth and actually use that to get people integrated in the community, but then also as a level of validation. That's a really cool idea.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think even in the software development world where you have distinct QA roles, I mean, just in my past, I've tended to like it better when everyone's responsible for quality than just a few people, so I think I like that better, that model, that sort of peer model of pulling people in. And everyone's interested in the same thing. Everyone's driven by quality and is trying to accomplish the same thing.
I think from the data engineering perspective, that's true as well. As long as if everybody has responsibility for good data and cleansing data and ensuring data quality, that's much easier than being like this one person. It's your whole job to make sure this data set is good, right?
Yeah.
So.
Oh, sorry, Amar, go ahead.
I think there's also then occasionally you end up with this tendency among maybe very overworked and very busy people to go, it's okay, the auditor will catch it. And you want to avoid that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about the overall process, and then we get to the end where you're actually trying to get these models into production, it seems like that's an often overlooked aspect of this. What have you seen in terms of issues that arise actually at that point of getting it into production? Have you seen anything arise in sort of the context of this conversation that late?
Sure. I think definitely we've found gaps and holes in our models, particularly in places where maybe there was low volume data or particular slices of granularity that we hadn't realized were quite as underfilled as we thought they were. And so we definitely go back to feedback from the end users whenever that happens. We get feedback on those and try to implement changes to the models to fix them.
Yeah.
I definitely have biases slip through all the way to the end.
How do you build that part into the process, I guess maybe for Amar? So when you're, particularly where the stakes are really high, you're delivering it to a client, are you able to iterate on that process in kind of the way that Randy's saying, and almost a little bit of an agile kind of manner where you're doing an iterative process and delivering that, not just to the person internally, like you said, which makes a lot of sense, but even to the client and actually taking a sort of an iteration through with the client?
Yeah. So, with my clients, it's not a, you give me the data, we talk about what the models we're running and what you're trying to find out, and then I come back to you with an answer. I do check-ins with them, and they, I give back information about what I'm seeing in their data, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that's a really great way for me they have that institutional knowledge that I don't necessarily have. So they can often come back to me and say, oh, hey, wait a minute, this is a problem, or this is not something we expected, or whatever. And then with the model itself, we always have sort of a preliminary rollout of like results. This is how it's flowing. This is what we're seeing. These are the numbers that are coming back.
Right.
And then we do a bunch of checks with them internally, and they, it may sound, it's very unscientific, but quite frankly, I work with a lot of CFOs and tax directors and finance directors, and their gut check is amazing. Like they can sniff a bad number from 1,000 paces, and and then we'll go back and check and iterate. For litigation, it's a little bit different. When that expert report goes out with that model, that's it. I think you can do some updates, but you can't change major pieces of the model. And then the opposing expert's going to rip it apart. You can do a rebuttal, but you're locked into a lot of the choices that you made unless you want to sit there and admit that you were wrong,
right,
which is really not a great look on an expert. And so, we do present the results of the models to our clients sort of at various points, but we iterate up until a point where we go, okay, this is the best we can possibly do with the data that we have. And then, that's what we finalize. But our situation is a little bit different there too, because it's, this is litigation about something that has happened. We're not trying to prepare for future state.
Right.
On the business side, with the work I'm doing for my clients, I have to think more about how this model works for the future. And we're predicting future state, and we're doing causal inference for future state. But for the litigation side, it's a little bit easier because it's, the past is what it is, and you're modeling that.
Yeah.
So that kind of it's just sort of different depending on what you're working on.
Yeah. That makes sense. So,
but I will say,
go ahead.
Huge danger with introducing any results to clients is, man, they get stuck on these numbers. And if you have a bad number in there, you will never hear the end of it.
Yep.
Yeah, iteration and clients, those two words don't, those aren't always the easiest words to couple together.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that in almost every area of tech I've found.
One of the other things that Amar brought up that I think is super important too is having that domain knowledge, the institutional knowledge piece actually integrated as part of the process throughout, rather than like a setup and an end check. Because I've definitely come across places in data. So one of the most dangerous things, I guess, in terms of bias in data is not data that's missing, but data that's populated and wrong.
Yeah.
Then you're like, it looks like everything's fine.
Right.
Take somebody who has a real gut check domain knowledge to be able to sniff out whether it's right or not. And in terms of institutional memory, there's just like, if you talk to the people who have been in and out of those data sets for years, then they'll be like, oh yeah, don't use that column. Everybody knows that column's bad. Unless you have somebody to tell you that, there's no indications that that's true, right? And so they end up building stuff on it and have a lot of dependencies there that can be really bad. So
with all of that being said, then what do you look for when you're hiring data scientists and you're trying to build out a team? What are you looking for skill-wise to sort of counter everything we're talking about here? And some of the ramifications are pretty significant, we talked about earlier. So how do you actually build a team then of people that really can avoid some of those missteps? Amar, how about you?
So I look for curiosity, an openness to learning and to being wrong, like able to take feedback. I look for a diversity in life experience and skill sets, especially in building the model, having people from a lot of different backgrounds. Really sort of, there are just gaps that my personal experience would have not allowed me to see that someone else might.
Yeah.
So that diversity of experience and skill set. And yeah, those are the primary things I'm looking for is, curiosity, openness to being wrong, diversity of life experience, and diversity of skill sets. We're an econ shop. We have a lot of economists. Being able to understand a market and demand and supply structures and drivers really quickly is super important. But we also have engineers, and we have sociologists, and we have people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, and that only makes us better.
Yeah. How about you, Randi?
Yeah, I was, one of the biggest things I think we look for is there's lots of people with lots of good technical skills, people who have good professional skills in terms of their communication and ability to understand and empathize with business partners, and that stuff are actually the big differentiators, I think, in terms of looking for new data scientists. There's lots of people that can, import scikit-learn and run models, but the number of people who know what questions are even worth answering and which things are going to be helpful to the business. If I run this model and get this prediction out, can I even do anything with that? Is that something that's useful to try?
Yeah.
So it kind of comes back to that curiosity that Amar was mentioning. But another thing I think is a proven ability to do independent work. One of the things that is kind of unique about the way we've implemented data science at Dell is that we have a federated model where data scientists are just kind of sprinkled throughout the business in lots of different business units. And so most data scientists are the first data scientists on their team, and they're working with people who have never done data science projects ever before. So that communication angle is hugely important, and the ability to be able to be kind of just thrown into the deep end and be like, find useful things to do is kind of just where we're at. And so there's lots of suggestions for projects from the business, but in terms of evaluating how difficult would that be to actually implement, how useful would it be even if you predicted that, and like giving that feedback to the business, and being able to then go execute kind of soup to nuts without a whole lot of guidance is a big part of where how we work as a data science shop. And so those are some of the key things that I focus on when I'm looking at new hires.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's interesting, Randi. When I've spoken to the economists at Amazon, they're deployed very much the same way. They're all in different business units and stuff like that. And they've said that one of the things that's been crucial for them is communicating with each other, which I'm guessing is probably huge for you guys too, is you're alone in your own business unit. You're handling, all the models for this product or whatever, and these stakeholders, but being able to go back and know that there are other data scientists working on other teams that you can talk to and get their feedback. Probably huge. So communication there is key, being willing to communicate with people who are outside your immediate team.
Right, exactly. That's something that we've been building up over the last, 9-ish months at Dell, is that internal data science communication. Huge. The number of times that we've been able to rely on someone's expertise that otherwise we wouldn't have known was even there, or reduce redundant work, because we're all trying to solve a lot of the same problems just from different angles. And so if we can leapfrog using the work that each other's done, it makes us a lot more powerful. So
yeah. So a couple questions have come in actually from attendees. One question, interesting question. Have you seen any benefits from clustering or unsupervised learning to compensate for bias caused by artificial segmentation?
I haven't used clustering that way. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's not an approach economists generally take. And I think from my perspective, a lot of our models are being run at the user level. So it's kind of when we start aggregating up to actually implement results that we run into trouble. The model itself seems like generally that it doesn't suffer from issues that much because we're not grouping that way. But that's an interesting idea. But again, economists don't generally use clustering that way, but we might be unique in that. I know, statisticians and other data scientists use it all the time in different ways.
Yeah.
One of the cool things about data science, so many backgrounds.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, now that I think about it, we have done a similar type of thing to basically find holes in our data to then go fill through other data collection mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have, when people call tech support, they're calling with different types of issues and stuff. And so we can build a model on all the data that we have, but then clustering the symptoms that are reported into kind of issue classes to be able to see there's certain issue classes that the agents maybe don't log as much information about because they can resolve them relatively quickly. And so then those, we can go know that we need to go ask for more information to get those to a state where we can actually use it for predictive purposes. So we have actually done that. Most of that is we've done the clustering to identify places where we need to go manually label new data.
Yeah, I will actually say you're right. We have used clustering to start figuring out broad segmentation groups and see whether our segmentation really works or not. But I don't know necessarily that I've deployed it in the modeling process as much. Just we did it more in terms of as we were figuring out how to implement, figuring out how best to segment our groups. If our instinct from the business side about how they should be segmented was total garbage or
not. Yeah. So I saw a follow-up there about how do you decide what's a hole to fill?
Yeah.
My example, there's two ways you can solve a problem with a computer. You either have to do something physically to the machine, replace a part, something like that, or you can do some sort of software fix where there's driver updates and things like that. It turns out that those part replacements are extremely well documented and there's all kinds of compliance around that and whatever else. But if an agent fixes you having password reset issues, there's not a whole lot of curation around collecting that data and making sure that we document what actually happened. And so those are places where we can see the mix from the historicals of how often those different issues happened. And then we can see the mix for how often we actually have logs for those things. And then in places where the match to the actual frequency versus the curated data frequency, that's where we fill the holes.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. So how do you, one other question that came in earlier is what are some things you can do to create a team culture, and Amar maybe answered this one, that promotes challenging each other's assumptions and methodologies? You talked about this earlier. Number one, obviously, hiring people, but how do you actually promote a culture where that's accepted and encouraged and just the norm?
So I think one thing that's really key is you never throw anyone under the bus. If there is a major mistake that has happened, and I've run into a few on my projects, there's a major mistake that happened, it's material, it's relevant, it's huge, I take the hit. I go to the client, I have that discussion, and there's nothing punitive about it when I go back and talk to my team. Because what I want to know is what went wrong, why, how do we stop that from happening again? Is this indicative of another problem that we should have caught? And I want everybody to feel okay engaging in that process without feeling like there's some sort of a witch hunt that's going to take them down.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there are failures of where someone was just, careless or sloppy or not paying attention or whatever. And, you address that on a one-on-one in an employee review. But from a project perspective, when things go wrong, I think it's really important to make sure that everybody knows that the priority or the thing that we care about as a firm is finding mistakes, owning them, and fixing them.
Right.
Yeah.
I actually have an interesting, the reason I'm like that is I came out of a social sciences research lab at UCLA, and I took over their database when I was working there, and our computer scientists left. And I found a mistake, just a single filter in SQL code that dropped something like 4 million of the 6 million patents from the USPTO database we were working with. And I was horrified. And of course I thought, this is just me. I'm an economist. I'm not a computer scientist. The person who wrote these millions of lines of code must know what he's doing. And, the more and more I checked, the more it turned out, oh no, this is a true thing. This happened. And the way the professors I worked with handled it really set the tone for me for the rest of my career. They came in and they thanked me. They asked what it would take to fix it. And then they issued retractions and pauses on all of their work.
Wow.
And, the priority absolutely there was fix it. Fixing it matters more than all of the citations we've gotten on the papers we've already issued.
Yeah.
And so I try and build that culture by making sure that, and they didn't at all blame him. They were like, he was overworked. It's a single piece of code. This definitely happens. What matters is moving forward.
Yeah.
That's why you have peer review.
Yeah.
Yeah, it very much comes from leadership, right? It's all about the tone you set in the organization, and it's a tone of seeking the truth, right?
Yeah.
You're actually trying to figure out what in the world's going on, not necessarily who did it.
Yeah.
I want to know.
There's a really great article. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Randi.
There's a really great article that Etsy put out a couple years ago about blameless postmortems.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically like a how-to guide on like how to run these kind of mediations with your team, basically when you're debriefing after something's happened, and how do you learn from it and move on, and fostering that kind of blameless culture where it doesn't matter who did it, let's just fix it. And it's a great starting point.
Yeah, it comes from the 5 whys, and that's uncomfortable, right? You continue asking questions about why it happened, and it's clear in the room exactly why it happened if it is a person that caused it. But that's not the problem. The problem is if you follow up with that and then there are repercussions clearly directly tied to that, if maybe that's the first time it happened, that's actually what causes the fear, right? Not the conversation around why it happened and how it happened. It's the repercussions after that. And it's definitely a challenge. One last question. How do you balance speed versus caution, or maybe validation in developing a model for consumption?
So I would say it depends on the stakes. If you just need rough answers and good enough very quickly, you value speed, right? And if the consequences of being wrong are not huge, and of course that's up to a team and a business to decide what huge is,
right,
and you just deploy and you fix on the fly and you iterate as you go, but you just go into production. Mm-hmm. If the stakes are high, if the results of this model really, really affect policy, money, legal cases, caution.
Yeah, that makes
that's a huge thing to have conversations with whoever the partners of the data scientists are. Like I almost feel like that's not even totally a data scientist's call. Like data scientists should figure out what all the caveats are and where there are places where there's an appropriate amount opportunity to apply caution and kind of a degree of risk associated with it. But at the end of the day, you need the context from the people whose money it is, whose end results are going to be impacted to help you balance that risk.
Yeah.
And I think where a data scientist's role is to, like, as Randi was bringing up, give those timelines, right? What are the trade-offs between speed and accuracy, and how does that affect things? And let the stakeholders decide on what their priority is there.
Yeah. Well, Mar, Randi, we really appreciate both of you being on this webinar. This has been really informative, really great discussion. And you're both very passionate about this idea. So it's good having you both on. And thanks for everyone that attended. And we'll be posting this on our blog. And so this will be available for others to view. But again, Amar and Randy, really appreciate both of you giving up your time to do this. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.